Mark chapter 14. Now the Passover and unleavened bread was 2 days off, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they were saying, "Not during the festival, because if we do that, there'll be a riot of the people." And while he was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, and reclining at the table, there came a woman with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume of pure nard, and she broke the vial and poured it over his head. Let's stop for a second and talk about this perfume. There are a couple of very interesting details here. First of all, he's at the home of Simon the leper. Why is that a big deal? Because lepers were unclean. And Simon, of course, before he became a leper, had a home, and he was supposed to be outside of the city in a leper colony, I'm sure, but he was at home, and Jesus was there with him, and so Jesus would have been ritually unclean and very close to the Passover and unleavened bread, and there probably wouldn't have been enough time for him to become ritually clean. So this is very telling of Jesus' attitude toward the religious authorities. He's reclining at the table there of Simon the leper. Now, to be fair, it doesn't say that Simon the leper was home. I was just assuming that he was, but that just occurred to me. But anyway, he's there at the home of Simon the leper, reclining at the table, and suddenly there shows up a woman with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume of pure nard. Alabaster is a soft stone, calcium carbonate. It is imported from Egypt. But the nard is a very costly, fragrant ointment. It's prepared from roots and hairy stems of an aromatic Indian herb, India. So we have here in Judea a vial from Egypt that's filled with a perfume from India, along the Silk Road or the Spice Road that came from India and ran all the way up into Britain, I think. Trade was going on, and it was extremely expensive. So think about that. An alabaster vial, stone from Egypt, filled with pure nard, which is an expensive perfume from India. Pretty interesting. And so she broke the vial and poured the pure nard over his head. But some were indignant, remarking to one another, "Why has this perfume been wasted? It might have been sold for over 300 denarii and the money given to the poor." Who's complaining about this? Jesus' disciples, if not his apostles. So they're complaining, and they were scolding her for doing this act. Would you do that? You know people in your church that would scold a person for doing an act like this? No one knows the motive but Christ, but God, right? We shouldn't be so quick to judge. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you bother her? She's done a good deed to me. Look," he says, "the poor you always have with you, and whenever you wish, you can go and do them good. But you do not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, that also which this woman has done shall be spoken in memory of her." And Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went off to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And they, the priests, were glad when they heard this, and promised to give him money. And he began seeking how to betray him at an opportune time. Verse 12. And on the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb was being sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city. A man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. Wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher says, where is my guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' and he himself will show you a large upper room furnished and ready, and prepare for us there." And the disciples went out and came to the city and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. And when it was evening, he came with the 12. So we have disciples in verse 16, disciples coming out and preparing the room, and Jesus came with the 12, which tells you what? There were more disciples there than just the 12 who were to become the apostles. And as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." And they began to be grieved and said to him one by one, "Surely not I." And he said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl." So it sounds like he's speaking here to disciples who are not one of the 12, doesn't it? It's one of the 12, he says, one who dips with me in the bowl. "For the Son of Man is to go, just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born." Although we needed someone to betray, didn't we? Verse 22. "And while they were eating, he took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to them and said, 'Take it, this is my body.' And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, 'This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I shall never drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God.' And after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, once they got to the Mount of Olives, 'You will all fall away, because it's written, I will strike down the shepherd and the sheep. I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised,' he says in verse 28, 'I will go before you into Galilee.' But Peter said to him, 'Even though all may fall away, I will not.' And Jesus said to him, 'Man, truly I say to you that you yourself on this very night, before a cock crows twice, shall 3 times deny me.' But Peter kept saying insistently, 'Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you.' And they were all saying the same thing too. Verse 32. And they came to a place called Gethsemane. Now, Gethsemane is a Hebrew word. It means olive press. And the way I understand an olive press, a Gethsemane, is that it's a large pillar-like stone that is hoisted up, and then the baskets of olives are put underneath there, and then the stone is set back down on the olives, and it's just allowed to sit there for some time as gravity forces it down, and it squeezes the olive oil out of the olives, and that's how they extract olive oil. It was the Garden of Gethsemane, in other words, the Garden of the Olive Press. They came to that place, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here until I have prayed.' And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be very distressed and troubled. And he said to them, 'My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch.' And he went a little farther beyond them and fell to the ground and began to pray that if it were possible, the hour might pass him by. And he was saying, 'Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what thou wilt.'" Did you ever notice or wonder what cup? We talked about this already in an earlier broadcast. What cup Jesus is talking about and why he says, "Remove this cup from me"? Because in Jeremiah 25, we have the image of the cup of the grapes of wrath. The cup of the grapes of the wrath of God. The cup of the grapes of the wrath of God. Jesus was going to have to drink of the cup of the wrath of God. And he came in verse 37 and found them sleeping and said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy. And they didn't know what to answer him. They were at a loss for words. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It's enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Arise, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up, not just a regular disciple, one of the 12. Judas came up, accompanied by a multitude with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now he who was betraying him, this is Judas, had given them a signal, saying, whomever I shall kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard. And after coming, he immediately went to him, saying, Rabbi, and kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But a certain one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And we know from a different gospel that happened to be Peter. And the name of the slave was Malchus. And Jesus answered and said to them, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as against a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching. You didn't seize me. But this has happened that the scriptures might be fulfilled. And they all left him and fled. And who was they? All his disciples. And a certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him, but he left the linen sheet behind and escaped naked. I don't know who this was. I don't know the story behind this. Verse 53. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. And Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. They were not finding any, for many were giving false testimony against him, and yet their testimony was not consistent. And some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. And the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent, made no answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him, saying, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Jesus here is referring back to the cloud rider of Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, of course. And the Son of Man is a big reference in the Jewish world. And so he called himself the Son of Man and claimed to be the cloud rider. And this is very upsetting to everyone. And the high priest tore his robes. Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need have we of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And some began to spit at him and to blindfold him and beat him with their fists and say to him, prophesy. And the officers received him with slaps in the face. And as Peter was below, meanwhile, down in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, you too were with Jesus the Nazarene. But he denied it, saying, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what you're talking about. And he went out onto the porch. And the maid saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, this is one of them. But again he was denying it. And after a little while, the bystanders were again saying to Peter, "Surely you are one of them. You're a Galilean." He began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you're talking about." And immediately a cock crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark to him, "Before a cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he began to weep. A lot happened in this chapter, didn't it? A lot of famous things. This is the making of Christianity. Chapter 15, which we'll get to next time, contains the crucifixion. So we've got another good chapter coming up. But there are only 2 more chapters, Mark 15 and 16. And that's it for the book of Mark. All right. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.